I found a British edition of Inky the Indigo Fairy. In the UK, she's called Izzy the Indigo Fairy. I have no idea why the American editors changed her name to Inky. It's not like Izzy is an uncommon name in the United States. Anyway, here's another video showing off all the various changes between the two versions of the book. I'm not going to include spelling changes or minor grammatical changes. Chapter 1. The numbering changes. The US version starts on page 1, but the UK version starts on page 9. Rachel sighed becomes Rachel said with a sigh. Oh, and for the record, when I say becomes, I mean I say what the original UK version is, and then what the United States American version is. So the first one is always the UK one. That's the official version of the book, because that's the version of the book which came out first. Okay. So, getting back to the video. Rachel sighed becomes Rachel said with a sigh. Purpley black becomes purplish black. Horrible day becomes terrible day outside. There was just room becomes there was just enough room. You know becomes but you know. It might be becomes it could be. Evil Jack Frost becomes mean Jack Frost. They only had Izzy and Heather left to find becomes only Inky and Heather were left to find. She reminded Kirsty becomes Rachel reminded Kirsty. Maybe he's trying becomes what if he's trying? Hope it stops soon becomes hope the rain stops soon. For a moment becomes for a minute. Dusty old books and becomes dusty old books that looked like they hadn't been read in a long time. It was so big she had to becomes it was so big that Kirsty had to. Find fairies becomes find fairies today. Bluey purple becomes purplish blue here and everywhere else in the book. She said shakily becomes she said. Rachel looked becomes Rachel looked more closely. Gleaming with a soft bluey purple light becomes shining with a soft bluish purple light. Clearly there is no consensus on what color indigo is. Glowing indigo becomes glowing indigo too. Fly out becomes fly right out. The first page becomes the first page of the book. They looked down at a brightly colored picture becomes they looked in the book and saw a colored picture. Beside it becomes next to. For a moment becomes for just a minute. Just then is added to the start of the sentence about snowflakes, in case you were confused about when things were happening. Spinning snow cloud becomes spinning cloud of snow. Reached for Rachel's hand becomes reached for Rachel's hand and held on tight. She whispered becomes she replied. Chapter 2. Rucksacks becomes backpacks. Trees loomed becomes trees towered. They becomes the girls. Kirsty looked even more scared becomes Kirsty looked frightened. Trying to stop becomes trying to keep. She laughed becomes Rachel laughed. I notice that happens a lot. They switch from saying she to Rachel or Kirsty, which is not really necessary. There are only two characters. It's not hard to keep track of who's doing what. And in any case, icing sugar becomes powdered sugar here and everywhere else. The US version deletes the sentence, I wonder where this forest is. See a glow through the trees becomes see a glow coming through the trees. Let's go and find out becomes let's go find out. They becomes the girls. Set off becomes headed towards the glow. Trainers becomes sneakers. Rachel nearly jumped out of her skin becomes Rachel jumped. I trod on a twig becomes I stepped on a stick. Goblins becomes do you think it could be goblins? Too sweet and soft to be goblins' voices becomes too sweet to be goblins' voices, so it's not a soft voice anymore. Dazzling becomes beautiful. Sweets becomes candy here and everywhere else. Golden toffees becomes golden caramels here and everywhere else. They heard the voices again. They spun around to see who it was. That becomes the girls heard the voices again, and they spun around. Chatting to becomes talking to. Little becomes small. They were so busy they hadn't noticed Rachel and Kirsty yet. Becomes they were so busy that they hadn't noticed Rachel or Kirsty yet. We must be fairy, or at least elf-sized again, becomes we must be fairy-sized again. We haven't got becomes we don't have. Cornet's name is changed to Cone. Far away from here becomes far away. she's so clever and kind becomes, she's so smart. And they led Rachel and Kirsty through the archway of pink and gold sweets becomes, then they led Rachel and Kirsty through the candy archway. Strawberry cream becomes whipped cream. Milk chocolate becomes chocolate. Squashy becomes squishy. Village street becomes street. Boiled sweets becomes jelly beans. Sweet shop becomes candy store. The phrase spotting a garden gate made of stripy rock is removed from the US version. Looking smart becomes looking stylish. Currant becomes chocolate. With boots becomes in boots. Glistening becomes sparkling. Kirsty and Rachel smiled at each other with delight becomes Rachel and Kirsty smiled at each other. What a fun place this was! You're in a hurry becomes are you in a hurry? Hung it out to dry on my washing line becomes hung it out to dry. Before she gets into any more trouble becomes before she causes any more trouble. Hand clapped over his mouth becomes hand over his mouth. Gasped cornet becomes cone gasped. The lemonades turned bluey purple becomes the lemonade is a purplish blue color. Rounded the corner becomes turned around the corner. All talking at once, they sounded cross becomes they were all talking at once and they sounded angry. Dewberry becomes blackberry, here and everywhere else. They knew what fairy dust meant becomes fairy dust could only mean one thing. Chapter 3. A cheeky tinkling voice becomes a tiny voice. Don't be so cheeky, Inky. Indigo denim jeans becomes indigo jeans. Ink drop shaped silver earrings hung in her ears is removed. She has no earrings in the US version. I guess it's hard to tell with her hair covering her ears anyway. That's brilliant news becomes that's wonderful news. I've been so worried becomes I've been so worried about them. The story of the Nutcracker becomes the Nutcracker book. But is added to the start of the sentence. I can't go back. Walking out of the forest becomes walking through the forest. I borrowed your lovely bow tie to wrap around me while I had a little nap becomes I used your bow tie as a pillow while I took a little nap. Have you heard becomes have you all heard? Please can you becomes can you please? She darted forward becomes she jumped forward. Called everyone becomes everyone called. Golden toffee becomes hardened caramel. With Izzy darting becomes while Inky darted. As tall as a house becomes it was as tall as a house. Pieces of the toffee becomes pieces. Picked them up becomes picked up the pieces. Anyone would think it had been frozen becomes it almost seems like it has been frozen. The girls knew that is added to the start of the sentence whenever the goblins were nearby, blah 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 blah. A loud rumbling noise and a shout of look out is split up into two sentences in the US version. Straight towards them becomes right toward them. Grinning all over their ugly faces becomes with big mean grins on their faces. Chapter 4. They becomes the girls. Dashed becomes ran. Into each other becomes into one another. Lemon sherbet becomes cocoa powder. Peering through the sherbet becomes digging her way through the cocoa. All right becomes okay. The goblins have got me becomes the goblins got me. Have you got becomes do you have. Swung her rucksack off her back becomes swung her backpack around. Glowing faintly silver becomes glowing. She opened the fan up becomes she opened the fan. It was colored like the most beautiful rainbow becomes it looked like the most beautiful rainbow she had ever seen. Rachel gasped becomes Rachel said. Strawberry bootlaces becomes strawberry licorice. They were half dragging, half carrying her becomes they were dragging her. I'll go and tell becomes I'll go tell. He dashed off becomes he ran off in the other direction. After Inky is added to the phrase they ran up the road. Had got a head start becomes got a head start. Izzy was wriggling becomes Inky was wriggling and squirming. Looking at the jelly beans becomes looking at the jelly beans as they ran by with Inky. A big handful of beans becomes a big jelly bean. It gives us a chance of catching up becomes it gives me an idea of how to trick them. Shouted angrily becomes yelled. The goblins ate one bean after another, picking beans. That is split up into two sentences in the US version. I've got an idea becomes I have an idea. At the side of the road becomes on one side of the road. Beans which becomes beans that. Lifted up becomes grabbed. Look what I've got becomes look what I have. Chapter 5. She'd guessed what they were doing becomes she knew what they were doing. Keep hold of the fairy becomes hang on to the fairy. You'll eat all the beans becomes you'll eat them all. Handful of beans becomes armful of beans. In most cases, beans becomes jelly beans. That happens in a lot of places. I'm not going to mention them all because this video is long enough. Wriggled her feet becomes wriggled her feet free from the licorice ropes. Squabbling becomes arguing. Let's get out of here becomes let's get out of here before they realize that Inky is free. Landed gently becomes landed lightly. Welcome becomes hello. Tummies becomes stomachs. They've eaten becomes they ate. Izzy grinned becomes Inky said, grinning. As you have stolen becomes since you have stolen, and it swaps locations with you must be taught a lesson. Pick jelly beans becomes pick more jelly beans. Smiled the sugar plum fairy becomes the sugar plum fairy smiled. Several elves becomes a few elves. Laughed Izzy becomes Inky laughed. The US version adds the sentence, we would use fairy magic to fly back, but we don't know how to get there. There is your basket is removed. Rachel felt puzzled becomes Rachel is confused. Screwing up her face becomes squeezing her eyes shut tight. Inky's bubblegum bubble is pink in the UK version, but indigo in the US version. Bubblegum bubble becomes bubble. Brilliant becomes wonderful. The elves working in the jelly bean fields and the elves who had followed Rachel and Kirsty out of the village becomes the elves. Help to tie becomes help tie. I don't know if I got a misprint, but the UK edition forgot to color in Izzy's hair in the final illustration of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Looked at the leaves becomes looked over at the leaves. Rachel put away the fan becomes Rachel put the fan back in her pocket. Hung on to each other becomes hung on to one another and squeezed their eyes shut. Open at becomes open to. Cheeky voice becomes small, cheerful voice. Again, stop being so cheeky, Inky. The smell of dewberries drifted up becomes the smell of blackberries filled the air. Those lovely sweets becomes that wonderful candy. Tasted lovely becomes tasted delicious. They had rescued another fairy and escaped the goblins once again becomes they had escaped the goblins and rescued another fairy. Fairy story in a book becomes fairy tale. At the end of the book, they add the sentence, Rachel and Kirsty were so close to bringing the color back to fairyland, they could almost taste it. And that is it. There were over 170 changes in this 67-page book. That adds out to 2.5 changes per page. This is crazy times. Now I'm really hoping I don't find another UK edition of one of these books, because otherwise I would feel like I need to make another differences video. And this video just took so long to write. There's so many differences. But if the video is really, really popular, if people are extremely interested in seeing how the books changed from UK to US, then sure, I'll indulge you and try to find more British versions of the books. If not, I think I'm going to end the Rainbow Magic US versus UK edition differences series here.